All right, the usual suspects are all pretty much here because we can start. How's everybody doing? Uh, Hope good. Bef- just as preamble, I guess you saw we're going to be. Going to be moving pretty soon. The next week or so, moving to doing this just once a week. Partly so I can keep the study up. I need this. This is more work than I really thought it was going to be. Uh, I'm loving it, but it's a little work. And not sure what day of the week it'll be, but I think I'll probably try to keep it at 11:30. I kind of like. It's a nice time to be out on my deck for the weather, and I'm also starting the process already. I'm going to start putting these up. I'm going to edit off the little part at the beginning where I'm scratching and trying to figure out how the thing's going to work, and cut that off and put them up on YouTube so they're a little more accessible, easier to watch, everything else. So, anyway, we are in Revelation 3. We're going to be starting on the church at Sardis. And one of the things that I love about the 7 letters to the churches is how important it is to know about the cities themselves. There are these 7 cities. They're all situated in what we would call Western Turkey. They're pretty close, relatively close together. They're spread up from north to south in that end of Turkey. And Sardis is the one that one of the ones that knowing its history is so crucial to really understanding the letter. The letter makes it just comes alive when you know the history of Sardis. Sardis was back around 700 BC to about 550 BC. It was the capital of a very large empire, the Lydian Empire. But it had fallen and really hadn't been nearly as important before. It wasn't nearly as important as Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum. But they still thought of themselves very highly. Very high opinion of themselves. They were incredibly rich or incredibly wealthy city. A river that flowed through there had tons of gold in it. There's an old saying, I don't know that I hear it much, but so you may have heard, rich as Croesus, and that was the king of that area of Lydia, and the capital was at Sardis. And so they were loaded wealthy. And the cool thing was, for them, if you look it up if you just do a search on it, you'll see that the city of Sardis, even to the area there today, is a plain, and in the middle there is this 1,500 foot tall pedestal of rock that is where the fortress for Sardis sat. The fortress for Sardis sat, and it was round. It was like in the mesas you see in the Southwest, where it's not like a gradual build to something tall. It's just tall, right in the middle. So it seemed pretty impregnable. It seemed like who could possibly take you out, and that's what they thought of themselves. We are completely, nobody can touch us, and that turned out to be a detriment for them. They were at war with Persia. You may have heard Cyrus of Persia, and they were at war with him, and they had a battle out on the field that did not go well. So they retreated back to their capital city and thought they'd winter in the capital city. And matter of fact, they were so confident in the fortification of the fact that they were on top of this huge 1,500 foot rock mesa, that, by the way, the rock wasn't all that solid. It tends to chip away a little bit, so climbing it's like almost impossible. And so they thought they were perfectly safe, and the king actually sent home a lot of his army. He said, we'll start back next winter. Well, the Persians figured out how to get up there. They found a passageway, they found a tunnel, they found something, and they got up, attacked them, surprised them, found them basically asleep, and defeated them. That's how they got defeated. And there was no defenses up. they just, once they got past the first gate, it's over. There's nobody awake. Everybody's done. Then 300 years later, they're fighting some Greeks, and they go back up into their fortress at the top of this thing, and somebody found a vulnerable spot, climbed up, literally opened the gate and let his army in, and they wiped him out again. It's like, that's They just tend to fall asleep and let people take them out. They had been so big in the past, but were so, and this is really a crucial part of understanding the letter. They had been so important and so spectacular in the past, and they lived in it. They had tried to get an imperial temple. That was a big deal to get one of the official imperial temples. Okay, so they're in negotiations to get an imperial temple, and they're competing with Smyrna, who is another one of the really big cities. And Smyrna won because all that Sardis talked about was how cool we used to be, how big and important we used to be. And so that's the city of Sardis. So now let's go and read the letter, and we're going to see those points are going to be very important, and they're going to pop up, okay? It says, to the angel in church of Sardis write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Now, it's very important to note that he doesn't say anything positive about him. In every one of these letters but 2, he starts out and says, hey, here's something cool about you guys. In this one, there is nothing. Sardis and Laodicea, which we'll cover in a couple of days, do not have a positive statement about him. Matter of fact, it's not only just rare among the 7 churches, it's rare in the Bible. Paul wrote a bunch of letters. John wrote letters, Peter wrote letters, James wrote a letter. Whenever they write letters, there's a positive section everywhere but here. There's the letter to Laodicea, which we'll cover in a couple days, and the church of Galatians. When Paul wrote to the Galatians, he didn't have a brag on them section. And the reason is the problem they're confronting is so big. We talked about this in Colossians. I'll cover it real fast. I'll try to cover it real fast. The purpose of the brag on section, a letter in those days would be who's writing it, who they're writing to, something along the lines of grace, mercy, and peace would be how Paul would do it, followed by a brag section. And the purpose of the brag section was to establish the relationship, to remind them of the relationship that the 2 people had, so that the hard things they said later had a basis. In other words, if I'm writing to somebody who's a friend of mine and I got to tell them something difficult, I'm going to start out and remind them of the relationship so they should listen. But in these 3 letters, Galatians, Philadelphians, and here, it's such a big deal that a relationship doesn't matter. It's too big a problem, okay? So, this is a huge trouble. And they, as a city, used to be something, and now the church that is in that city has adopted that. We used to be something, and we're not anymore. And then he comes back with, wake up, verse 2. Strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. And the first thing you think of, wake up, is the fact that they were always being attacked by people while they were asleep. Okay, they're up in their tower, and they're asleep, and they get attacked. And now the church is the same way. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. So this church is just like this city in that it is falling asleep. It's not paying attention. It's living on past glory. That wake up section reminds me of Romans 13. I was reading that this morning. And do this understanding the present time. This is Romans 13, verse 11 and following. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy, but rather clothe yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. These people, apparently this church, just like the city they were from, had been very active, very positive, very much making an impact for the kingdom of God. As we would probably say, they were loving God and they were loving people. That they were doing the things they were supposed to be. They're going to take care of the least and reaching the lost. They're doing all these things, but they had gone to sleep as a church. And John is reminding them, remember what happened when your city fell asleep. Because when your city got comfortable and felt everything was good, they fell asleep, and they fell twice to an enemy that shouldn't have been able to get to them, but their defenses were down and they weren't even trying. Okay? So verse 2 says, wake up. Verse 3 says, remember. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard. Hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. Now that reminds us of Jesus' statement that he's going to come like a thief in the night, and it also reminds the people of Sardis of the 2 times that they forgot to put up a defense and the enemies were able to take them out like a thief. It's a very important piece. Pay attention, stay awake, do the things that matter. And it's interesting to me that this church doesn't get a commendation. Jesus brags on them for nothing, but he also doesn't point out any huge things they're doing wrong. He doesn't say, like he tells some of the other churches, okay, you're listening to false teachers. He tells some of them, you've lost your first love. He tells them really important things, but every one of them still got a commendation, still got bragged on. This one just fell asleep. This was a bunch of Christians who, for the most part, had just fallen asleep. They were now lackadaisical in their faith. They were just going through the motions. They weren't striving to stay pure. They weren't striving really hard to keep their doctrine pure. They were just whatever. It was the church of whatever. And we can fall into that. We can become the Christians, the church of whatever. With no passion, with no power, no anything. A church that sleepwalks. I'll tell you this. I know an awful lot. I hear an awful lot of people and Christians. I don't hear as much in the circles I tend to run in now, but I see some people and they're just killing time till Jesus comes or they die. They've accepted Christ and now they're asleep until it's over. And that's, I think, kind of what's going on here. They've just fallen asleep. They're not diligent. They're not active. They're just there. Okay? But he does go on and finally gives us something positive after he talks about how the thief's going to come and take them out. Yet you do have a few people in Sardis, verse 4, who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me dressed in white, for they are worthy. And that dressed in white, that's a symbol that is so... That's a pretty easy symbol, isn't it? The whole, okay, we're dressed in white because we're worthy. White seems to always, in church and in secular situations, it's a symbol of purity. You are holding the standards. So he's saying, but 2 things at once. He's saying some of you are still holding to God's standards. You're living God's principles in your life. But he's also saying there's a bunch of you who aren't. You're a church that is compromising itself in the way that it lives. And then you don't care enough to say anything about it. You just let it happen. But thankfully, there's a few of you who are dressed in white, okay? And then it says they will walk with me. Anybody think of a time when God... Yeah. I mean, you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and they walked with God in the cool of the evening. You go to Enoch, and he's walking with God. And walking with God is like this really cool thing of having the relationship with God and not forgetting that. You go into even after when Jesus rises from the dead. Remember, he's on the road to Emmaus, and he walks with those 2 people along the road for a while, and he walks with them. And the old song my grandma loved, he walks with me and he talks with me. It was called In the Garden. I come to the garden and he walks with me, he talks with me. That relationship there. So we see 2 things that this church has lost. It's not holding its standards. They're not living up to God's standards of purity and just in life. And they're not in a relationship with God, because if you're not living up at all purely, it's hard to have a relationship with God. And I think those are 2 ways we fall asleep. One way we fall asleep is we stop living God's standards. We just relax. I don't think that's that big a standard, and that's bugging me. I'm going, there are places in my life where I'm doing that. That's possible. And the second is we relax in our relationship, and we're too busy to spend time with God, or there is a really cool Netflix special. So one of the things that I've been I kicked myself on it and realized I'd done this, was we moved to this house, and we got it's in a subdivision, but there's lots of woods and lots of trees, and there's a pond and there's a lake, and I was like, man, when I get into there, I've got the woods, I can start taking walks. I'm not an outdoor person, but I do love walking and talking with God. I think that's outside. That's a really cool thing if the weather's great. And I was in this place and I hadn't done it any. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's one of the reasons I was looking forward to this place, was that quiet time with God, just walking around. This week I've already Monday and Wednesday, I was able to get out and take a walk and be with God. I grew up in the country. I grew up around trees, so being around trees makes me think of God a lot of ways. And it was like, you know what? I've been too busy to take time with God, and that's a way of falling asleep. So the question to ask yourself as we look at this church in Sardis, am I falling asleep in our morals, letting our standards drop? I'm not talking being a legalist, but I am talking about trying to live into God's principles in your life, living in a way that pleases Him. And am I falling asleep and not spending time with Him? Which is, kind of ironic, because how many times do people fall asleep while praying? And see, that's the picture here. Okay. Now, let's move on to verse 5. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. And here's something. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and His angels. And that concept of being in God's book, that person is in God's book and never being blotted out of God's book. And let me just, that one little piece there. I just have this picture right here. Okay, so here I am. The church in Sardis is a church that is falling asleep and is surprised all the time. But he says these people, the ones who keep their moral standards, the ones who keep the time with God, those two big pieces, and whatever it takes to not be asleep and unaware, but who are alert and alive in their faith, it says, Jesus says, but I will acknowledge that name before my Father and His angels. And by the name, it means the person. And picture that for just a second, okay? I don't know how literal it is. It doesn't matter. It is such a cool picture that He's giving us, where we're standing there and Jesus is acknowledging us before the Father, acknowledging you before the Father. You're standing right there before God, and it's almost like Jesus going, this one's with me. I will stand up for this one. This person right here, I will acknowledge before my Father. This one, she's one of us. He's one of us. Isn't that cool? Picture yourself there. Picture Jesus doing that. I think that's a really cool picture, and it's a really good reason not to fall asleep. The city of Sardis was famous because they had been great. They had done great things. And a lot of people who are watching, you have done some really cool things for God. Okay? What are we doing now? Are we still standing for His principles? Are we still living with Him? Are we still accomplishing things for Him? Don't fall asleep like the city of Sardis, which fell asleep and got captured twice. But stay awake, stay diligent, stay on your toes, keep serving, keep living God's principles, keep spending time with Him, and keep doing things that matter for Him. Okay? That's the lesson from the book of the letter to the church of Sardis. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.